The notice came taped to my fence at dawn, thick paper, red stamp, and a number so outrageous I laughed before my hands started shaking. I'd owned that land longer than most of the houses around it had existed, long enough to remember when the dirt road was just dust and deer tracks, long enough to bury memories where the oak trees still stood. So when the Homeowners Association, calling itself the Ridgebrook Civic Council, slapped me with a $412,000 violation penalty, it felt less like paperwork and more like a threat. The letter accused me of unauthorized structures, landscape noncompliance, and environmental misuse. Big words, vague claims, and a deadline that gave me 10 days to pay or face enforcement. No explanation of how they calculated the fine. No reference photos. Just a signature from a woman named Clara Wainscott, the HOA chair, whose name I'd never heard until that moment. I walked the property line again that morning, boots sinking into soil I knew better than any surveyor. The so-called violations, a memorial bench near the creek, a tool shed my father helped me build years ago, native plants I refused to replace with decorative gravel, things that had existed long before Ridgebrook's pastel mailboxes and matching fences. When I called the number on the notice, I didn't get answers. I got attitude. Clara's assistant told me I was lucky the board hadn't escalated further and suggested I pay quickly to avoid liens. That word liens hung in the air like smoke. They spoke as if the land was already theirs, as if my ownership was a technical inconvenience. Neighbors started avoiding eye contact. A few whispered apologies. One older man quietly warned me the HOA had lawyers on retainer and a history of pushing people until they folded. Apparently, fines like this were how they kept order, or silence. That night, I pulled the old metal lockbox from my closet. Inside were deeds, plats, and yellowed correspondence, documents my mother insisted I keep after my father passed. I hadn't opened it in years. I didn't expect answers. I just wanted reassurance. What I found instead was a chain of ownership that didn't match Ridgebrook's story at all. Parcel maps that didn't align, transfers that stopped short, a survey line that curved around, not through, my land, and a note in my father's handwriting that read, "If they ever question it, start here." By morning, the fine no longer scared me. It intrigued me, because if those papers were right, and they looked very right, then the HOA hadn't just overreached. They'd built their entire authority on something they never owned. And the moment I realized that, I stopped worrying about how to pay their fine and started wondering how much they owed me. By the second day, the fine wasn't just a number, it was a weapon, and Ridgebrook had decided to swing it hard. Another envelope arrived, this one hand-delivered. Same red stamp, stronger language. It warned of immediate enforcement actions, including liens, restricted access, and legal escalation. They even cited community harmony as justification, as if harmony came from bullying one landowner into submission. I decided to attend the next HOA meeting. The Ridgebrook clubhouse sat on what used to be open meadow, glass walls, polished stone, and a sign out front that read private property, residents only. The irony didn't escape me. I walked in anyway. The room went quiet. At the front sat Clara Wainscott, perfectly composed, blazer crisp, smile tight. She spoke about rules, about order, about how individuals who resist compliance undermine the entire neighborhood. When she finally acknowledged me, she didn't invite discussion. She announced my violations like a verdict already decided. I asked one simple question. "Can you show me where your authority over my land actually comes from?" Murmurs spread. Clara didn't like that. She deflected, citing bylaws, community charters, enforcement clauses, lots of words. No deeds, no surveys, no dates. When I pressed again, she shut me down. said my documents were outdated, my claims confusing, and warned the board would proceed regardless. The fine, she reminded everyone, would grow with penalties and fees. After the meeting, two neighbors pulled me aside. One admitted the HOA had fined him 5 figures over a fence placement. Another said their shed permit was lost until they paid an administrative correction fee. Everyone had a story. Everyone was afraid to push back. That night, I spread my documents across the table and started comparing them to public records. Parcel IDs, transfer histories, subdivision filings. What I found wasn't just messy, it was alarming. The original development had carved Ridgebrook out in phases, but my land sat underneath all of it like a missing puzzle piece. The neighborhood roads, the clubhouse, even some of the homes, everything referenced an easement that had never been finalized. The developer had built first and planned to fix it later. Later never came. Somewhere along the way, the HOA inherited power, but not ownership. They enforced rules on land they assumed was theirs because no one had ever challenged it. Until now. I requested certified copies from the county office the next morning. The clerk raised an eyebrow when she saw the parcel numbers. "You don't see these come up often," she said. "Most folks don't know what they're sitting on." By the end of the week, Ridgebrook escalated again. Another notice, higher penalties. A deadline meant to scare me into paying before I understood the full picture. Too late. Because the deeper I dug, the clearer it became. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a house of cards. And all it would take was one good look at the right document to make the entire thing collapse. The certified copies arrived in a plain brown envelope. But what they revealed hit harder than any legal threat the HOA had thrown at me. Inside were plat maps stamped decades ago, long before Ridgebrook had a name. The lines were unmistakable. My parcel wasn't adjacent to the neighborhood. It sat beneath it, in layered legal terms that most people never bother to read. Roads, greenbelts, even several residential lots referenced an easement that traced back to my property and then simply stopped. No release, no transfer, no compensation. I took the documents to a local land use attorney named Marcus Hale, someone known for avoiding drama and chasing facts. He didn't smile when he read them. He leaned back, reread the pages, and finally said, "They fined you how much?" When I told him the number, he let out a slow breath. According to Marcus, this wasn't just an overzealous HOA. It looked like a development shortcut that had snowballed into institutional negligence. The original developer had likely assumed no one would notice, or that any future challenge could be buried under intimidation and legal fatigue. Marcus sent formal requests to the HOA for their ownership proofs. Deeds, recorded easements, transfer documents, anything. Their response came fast and thin. A PDF packet full of bylaws, meeting minutes, and enforcement policies. Still no land title. Meanwhile, the pressure ramped up. Ridgebrook posted notices at the edge of my property warning residents to avoid unauthorized areas. Security vehicles started cruising past my fence. A letter hinted at legal action for interfering with community operations. It was intimidation, plain and simple, dressed up as governance. Neighbors began asking questions, quietly. One family told me their mortgage company had recently requested updated land verification. Another said their title insurance suddenly flagged a potential underlying claim. Fear was spreading, not because of me, but because truth has a way of doing that. Marcus filed a notice of claim with the county, attaching the certified plats. That single filing triggered something no one at Ridgebrook expected, a mandatory review. Within days, the HOA's tone changed. Emails softened. Deadlines blurred. Clara herself called, speaking carefully now, asking if there might be a misunderstanding we could resolve privately. I told her the same thing I'd asked at the meeting. "Show me where your authority comes from." She didn't answer. Instead, the HOA's attorney reached out with a proposal to pause enforcement while clarifications were explored. It wasn't an apology, but it was a retreat. Because once those plats were on record, the situation stopped being about a fine. It became about what happens when an entire neighborhood realizes its foundation, legal and literal, might not be what it was promised. And as that realization spread, the question shifted from whether the HOA was wrong to how far the consequences would reach. The day the county posted the review notice, Ridgebrook stopped acting like an authority and started acting like a suspect. The notice wasn't dramatic, just a small update on a public board, parcel ownership clarification pending. But within hours, the neighborhood felt different. Construction crews vanished. Security patrols thinned. The clubhouse parking lot, once full during board meetings, sat half empty. Marcus explained what was happening behind the scenes. Once a title review starts, lenders pay attention, insurers pay attention, and anyone who signed paperwork without confirming ownership starts sweating. Ridgebrook's power depended on the assumption that everything beneath it was settled. That assumption was gone. Clara called again, this time asking for a conversation. We met at a cafe outside the neighborhood, neutral ground. She brought a folder thick with documents. I brought copies of the plats. She talked about misunderstandings, legacy errors, and how nobody intended harm. I listened. Then I slid one map across the table. It showed the neighborhood lots stacked neatly on paper, with my parcel number printed underneath them in faded ink. Clara stared at it longer than she meant to. I didn't press. I didn't have to. She said the board was willing to reduce the fine. Then waive it. Then suggested a mutual non-disclosure agreement. Each offer landed softer than the last, like a door slowly closing. I asked a different question. How many homes are built on land the HOA never owned? She didn't answer that either. By the end of the week, rumors filled the gaps. Residents reported banks requesting updated surveys. A title company quietly pulled out of a pending sale. The HOA sent a vague email about temporary administrative adjustments. No details, no reassurance. Marcus filed a second document, this one asserting underlying ownership claims over shared infrastructure. Roads, green spaces, utility corridors. It wasn't aggressive, it was precise. And precision is far more dangerous. That filing triggered notices to every homeowner whose lot referenced the incomplete easement. Suddenly, hundreds of people had a reason to look at their paperwork. And once they did, they saw what Ridgebrook had never disclosed. The HOA tried to regain control with a town hall-style meeting. Clara spoke about unity and patience. Someone in the back asked a simple question. Do we actually own our land? The room went silent. That was the moment the balance shifted, not because of anger, but because trust evaporated. Ridgebrook's authority had always rested on confidence. Once that cracked, no fine or bylaw could patch it. I drove home that night past streets I'd watched grow from dirt to pavement. I didn't feel victorious, just resolved, because the truth was out now, and it doesn't retreat once it's been seen. What Ridgebrook didn't realize yet was that the review wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something far bigger. When fear replaces authority, mistakes start happening fast, and Ridgebrook made plenty of them. 2 days after the chaotic town hall, I received a certified letter from the HOA's legal firm. The tone was different. No fines, no threats, just requests for clarification and temporary cooperation. They wanted access to my original deeds, survey pins, and historical purchase records. Marcus laughed when he read it. "They're not building a case," he said. "They're trying to understand how deep the hole is." Meanwhile, the neighborhood itself was unraveling. Residents began knocking on my gate not to argue but to ask questions. Some were polite, some were panicked. A few were angry, not at me, but at the board that had promised them certainty. One couple showed me their closing documents. The legal description referenced a master parcel that no longer existed on record because it had never been legally subdivided. Another homeowner said their bank had frozen a refinance pending clarification. That's when the real pressure began. Once lenders get nervous, everything stops. Ridgebrook attempted damage control. They issued a statement claiming the land issue was purely administrative and that homeowners had nothing to worry about. But those words couldn't override what people were seeing with their own eyes. Emails from banks, title flags, delayed sales. Then came the boldest move yet. The HOA announced an emergency vote to retroactively approve land transfers. Marcus shook his head. "You can't vote ownership into existence." They tried anyway. The meeting was held in the clubhouse, packed beyond capacity. Lawyers sat in the front row. Homeowners filled the aisles. Clara read from prepared remarks, insisting the vote would stabilize the community. When the floor opened, someone asked if I'd agreed to transfer the land. Clara hesitated, just long enough. The vote passed among board members, but it meant nothing. Without my signature, without proper filings, without county approval, it was theater. Expensive, desperate theater. That same week, Marcus submitted a formal notice of ownership assertion. It wasn't a lawsuit. It was a declaration, public, recorded, and impossible to ignore. It stated that any use of the land without consent constituted unauthorized occupation. The effect was immediate. Construction equipment shut down mid-project. Contractors pulled out rather than risk liability. The HOA's insurance provider requested an urgent review, and one developer quietly walked away from a planned expansion. I wasn't blocking roads. I wasn't cutting utilities. I didn't need to. All I did was stand where the law already placed me. That night, Clara called again. No folder this time, no rehearsed language, just a tired voice asking if there was a way forward. I told her there was, but it wouldn't be cheap, quick, or quiet. What Ridgebrook didn't know yet was that the cost of moving forward wasn't money alone. It was control. Once power cracks, the scramble to survive exposes everything people tried to hide. Clara showed up the next morning, not at my gate, but with 2 attorneys and a surveyor. No cameras, no bravado, just paperwork and unease. They wanted to walk the property boundaries together, a phrase that really meant, "Please don't embarrass us further." The surveyor placed fresh markers beside the old iron pins I'd never removed. When they matched perfectly, one of the attorneys went silent. The other cleared his throat and asked how long I'd been aware of the overlap. "Since before the first foundation was poured," I said. That was the moment the narrative collapsed. They'd told homeowners the land issue was new. Minor, correctable. But the truth was worse. This had been discoverable from day one. Ignored, buried, rushed past in the name of deadlines and profit. Later that afternoon, Ridgebrook sent a community-wide email admitting there was a title discrepancy. Carefully worded. No admission of fault, but it was enough. Panic spread faster than facts ever could. Real estate agents pulled listings, buyers backed out, appraisers marked properties as at risk. And the HOA board, once untouchable, started pointing fingers at each other. Clara resigned 3 days later. The replacement board inherited a mess they didn't create and didn't know how to fix. Their first action was to suspend all fines and enforcement notices, including the original $350,000 violation they'd slapped on me. Too late, Marcus filed suit the same morning, not for revenge, but for clarity. A quiet action to formally affirm ownership, recover damages for unauthorized use, and halt further development until the matter was resolved. The county moved faster than expected. Records were reviewed. Maps were cross-checked. A clerk called to confirm whether I intended to pursue consolidation of parcels. That question sent a shockwave. Because if approved, consolidation would mean the HOA didn't just mismanage land. They never legally owned the neighborhood footprint at all. Developers scrambled. One attempted a private settlement offering cash and silence. I declined. Silence was what caused this. At the next community meeting, homeowners demanded answers. One stood up and asked whether their houses were technically sitting on leased ground. No one answered. That's when I spoke not as an enemy, not as a victor, but as the person holding the truth. I told them I wasn't there to evict families or cause chaos. I wanted acknowledgement, correction, and fair compensation. The room exhaled. But the board knew the stakes had changed. This was no longer about a fine or a dispute. It was about who truly controlled the land beneath their feet. And control, once lost, doesn't come back quietly. What the HOA still didn't realize was that the most expensive mistake wasn't building without permission. It was assuming I'd settle for less than the truth. When fear replaces authority, people start making deals they never imagined they'd need. The following week, everything shifted behind closed doors. I began receiving calls, not threats this time, but invitations. Quiet ones, developers, former board members. Even a lender connected to Ridgebrook's original financing reached out, asking if I'd consider a global resolution. That phrase meant one thing. They were terrified of what discovery would expose. Because once ownership was challenged, every contract tied to that land came under scrutiny. Marcus explained it simply. If the HOA never held clear title to the underlying parcels, then every fine, lien, rule enforcement, and restriction could be challenged. Years of authority built on assumption might evaporate overnight. That reality started hitting homeowners too. A group formed calling themselves the Ridgebrook Property Coalition. Regular families, not agitators. They wanted transparency, stability, and reassurance their homes wouldn't become collateral damage in a legal war they never asked for. I agreed to meet them. We gathered in the community center, neutral ground. No cameras. No lawyers at the table, just nearby. I told them the truth as plainly as I could. I had no interest in forcing anyone out. Their homes mattered. Their lives mattered. But the land dispute couldn't be ignored anymore. Someone asked the question everyone feared. Can the HOA even exist if they don't own the land? The answer was complicated, but unsettling. Legally, an HOA's authority flows from covenants tied to land ownership. If that foundation cracks, everything built on top becomes questionable. Not automatically void, but vulnerable. That's when I made an offer. I proposed granting permanent easements and long-term ground use agreements, fairly priced, transparent, and recorded publicly. In return, the HOA would acknowledge the mistake, dissolve outstanding penalties tied to the disputed parcels, and fund corrective legal filings for affected homeowners. It wasn't a power grab. It was a reset. The room buzzed. Some were relieved. Others angry, less at me than at the board that put them here. One homeowner stood and said something that stuck with me. We trusted them to protect us. Instead, they protected themselves. 2 days later, the coalition voted overwhelmingly to support my proposal. That vote changed everything. The HOA board had no mandate left. Their authority depended on homeowner confidence, and that confidence was gone. Under pressure, they entered mediation, not with me, but with their own members watching every step. Financial audits followed. Emails surfaced. Meeting minutes revealed warnings that had been ignored. The $350,000 fine against me, drafted as leverage, not enforcement. Once that came out, regulators took interest. The county attorney's office requested documentation. The state licensing board asked questions about the developer's disclosures. What started as a land dispute was becoming a governance reckoning. And the HOA, once so quick to fine, was now counting its losses. But while they were scrambling to survive, one final detail was about to surface. Something that would redefine who truly owned Ridgebrook, not just on paper, but in practice. Some truths don't arrive loudly. They surface quietly, then change everything. The detail that unraveled Ridgebrook didn't come from court or confrontation. It came from a dusty annex in the county record's office. Marcus had been reviewing old plats when a clerk mentioned an odd consolidation request filed years earlier, withdrawn, but never corrected. The file referenced a master parcel, one that predated the subdivision entirely. My name was on it. We pulled the microfilm. There it was, an original deed change showing that the land Ridgebrook built upon wasn't a collection of individual lots at all, but part of a single, undivided tract that had never been fully severed. The HOA owned improvements, not the soil beneath them. Legally, that distinction mattered more than anyone realized. Because while homes can be sold, the land they sit on must be conveyed separately. And that conveyance never happened correctly. The developer transferred structures, not ground rights. The HOA inherited that flaw and then tried to enforce authority it never possessed. When this was presented in mediation, the room went still. The board's counsel asked for a recess, then another. By the third break, no one was making eye contact anymore. Word traveled fast. Lenders froze escrow on pending sales. Title insurers flagged every property. One underwriter sent a notice stating coverage might be rescinded unless the land issue was resolved. That was the moment the power dynamic flipped completely. The HOA could no longer function without my cooperation. Their covenants, dues, fines, everything depended on land rights they didn't control. And without resolution, the neighborhood would become legally radioactive. So I made a second offer, clearer this time. I proposed acquiring the remaining administrative shell of the HOA, dissolving it entirely, and replacing it with a land trust structure. Homeowners would retain their houses and gain recorded ground leases, stabilized for decades. Dues would drop. Enforcement would end. No more arbitrary penalties. It wasn't about ownership for ownership's sake. It was about restoring certainty. Homeowners demanded a vote. The board resisted, citing procedure, but procedure meant nothing without legitimacy. Under pressure from members, lenders, and regulators, the vote went forward. The result wasn't close. Over 70% supported dissolution and transition. The HOA's remaining officers resigned that evening. Ridgebrook's website went offline the next day. The $350,000 fine. Officially withdrawn, quietly, without apology. But the real cost was far greater: legal fees, settlements, loss of authority, a reputation that would follow every developer and board member involved. For the first time since this began, the neighborhood slept peacefully. Not because the conflict was gone, but because the truth had finally surfaced. And truth, once recorded, has a permanence power never does. What remained now was the final step. One decision that would determine whether this story ended in closure or became a warning no HOA could ignore. When the dust settles, The last decision isn't about winning. It's about what kind of ending you're willing to leave behind. With the HOA effectively dissolved and the legal framework shifting, all eyes turned to what I would do next. On paper, I held the strongest position possible. The land, the leverage, the support of the majority of homeowners. If I wanted to press harder, demand higher compensation, impose stricter terms, or drag the process through court for years, I could have. Everyone knew it. Developers assumed I would. Lawyers prepared for it. Even some homeowners braced themselves, worried that peace might be temporary. But escalation wasn't my goal. I requested one final meeting, this time with representatives from the homeowner coalition, county officials, and independent mediators present. No former HOA board members, no developers. This wasn't about assigning blame anymore. It was about closing a chapter responsibly. I laid out the final structure. Each homeowner would receive a recorded, long-term ground lease with automatic renewal clauses and fixed terms that couldn't be altered unilaterally. No surprise fees, no discretionary penalties, clear maintenance boundaries, clear access rights, everything written plainly, filed publicly, and protected by statute. In return, homeowners agreed to a modest annual ground use payment, far less than their previous HOA dues, and a one-time settlement fund to cover administrative transition costs. No back payments, no retroactive claims. The county reviewed it line by line. Title insurers weighed in. Lenders approved the framework. For the first time since Ridgebrook broke ground, every party involved agreed on the same thing. Stability mattered more than ego. During that meeting, a homeowner stood up and thanked me, not for winning, but for not exploiting the situation when I could have. That moment carried more weight than any legal victory ever could. The final paperwork took weeks. Deeds were clarified, leases recorded, notices mailed. The last traces of the HOA, its letterhead, accounts, enforcement notices were formally terminated. The neighborhood changed after that. People stopped whispering. Violation letters disappeared. Community events returned, not as obligations, but as choices. For the first time, residents felt ownership in the truest sense. Not control imposed from above, but security grounded beneath them. As for the developer and former board members, consequences followed quietly. Licensing reviews, insurance disputes, civil settlements handled outside the spotlight. No grand courtroom scene, just accountability catching up in its own way. The $350,000 fine that started everything became a footnote. Not because it was small, but because it was meaningless compared to what it revealed. Authority without foundation always collapses, and land, unlike power, doesn't pretend. All that remained now was the final step, the moment where this long fight became a lesson, not just for Ridgebrook, but for anyone who ever mistook control for ownership. Every story like this ends the same way, not with applause, but with a choice that echoes long after the noise fades. Months after the last document was recorded, I drove through Ridgebrook one final time, not as an adversary, not as an authority figure, but as someone closing a chapter. The streets were quieter, not tense, peaceful. The kind of calm that only comes after uncertainty has been removed. The signs were subtle but telling, no more warning placards. No more surveillance notices posted by a board that no longer existed. Just homes lived in by people who finally knew where they stood, literally and legally. The land trust structure held firm. Payments came in on time. Maintenance disputes were resolved without threats or fines. The system worked because it was grounded in transparency, not control, and because everyone involved knew the rules couldn't be rewritten behind closed doors. Looking back, what struck me most wasn't how easily authority had been abused, but how quickly it collapsed once questioned. The HOA had relied on fear, paperwork, and assumption. They never expected someone to read the documents, trace the history, and challenge the foundation itself. But land doesn't respond to pressure. It responds to truth. This wasn't a story about revenge or outsmarting anyone. It was about what happens when systems forget their limits, and what it takes to correct them without causing harm to the people caught in the middle. I didn't walk away richer in the way headlines might suggest. Legal fees, time, and stress took their share. What I gained instead was certainty, and the knowledge that standing firm, calmly, and consistently can dismantle even the most confident misuse of power. For homeowners, Ridgebrook became a cautionary tale shared in real estate circles. For developers and boards elsewhere, it became a reminder. Ownership isn't implied, authority isn't automatic, and shortcuts always surface eventually. And for me, it became something simpler. Proof that patience, preparation, and principle matter more than force ever could. If you found this story engaging or thought-provoking, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss stories like this one. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, hit like and comment your thoughts below. I'd love to hear how you think this situation should have been handled. Because the next story might look different, but the lesson behind it will feel strangely familiar.